First released in late 1997, Klonoa Door to Phantomile takes players on a whimsical journey through a dream world rich in finely crafted platforming action, paired with an emotionally charged presentation. Those who experienced Klonoa in its heyday almost certainly fell in love with it, but unfortunately, while critically successful, the game didn't exactly catch on. Despite this, however, Klonoa still managed to find enough of an audience to warrant multiple sequels. And on part 2 of our Klonoa series retrospective, that's what we're here to discuss. From the remarkable follow-up on PlayStation 2, the Game Boy Advance entries, all the way through the brand new remakes for modern consoles, we're looking at all of them today, complete with side-by-side comparisons showcasing exactly what's changed in the case of the remasters. All this and more is coming up on this episode of DF Retro, so let's get started. On March 4th, 2000, Sony unleashed PlayStation 2, and it was a smash hit from day one, becoming the best-selling game console of all time. As with the original model, Namco was there from day one, releasing the superb Ridge Racer 5 alongside the new console, with plenty more to follow. Among the games in development was a sequel to the original Klonoa Door to Phantomile, known as Klonoa 2 Seikai ga Nozonda Wasuremono, or as we know in the West, Lunatea's Veil. This follow-up was built on the hopes of series expansion, while simultaneously showcasing the new capabilities of PlayStation 2. Klonoa 2 would retain the silky smooth 60 frames per second update of that original game, but the developers were afforded the opportunity to increase stage complexity, flesh out the cast of characters, and integrate more ambitious sequences directly into the game. More so than the original, Klonoa 2 received an abundance of media coverage prior to release. PlayStation 2's success and the appetite for new games meant that Namco's floppy-eared mascot stood a real chance of finding a larger audience, at least that was the hope. As a fan of that original game then, I was excited to play this follow-up on PS2. I distinctly remember purchasing the game on its North American launch date of July 25th, 2001. Just after catching a mid-morning showing of Final Fantasy The Spirits Within with a couple friends, a movie I'll admit I did enjoy at the time. Upon arrival at a local GameStop, I was surprised to find a queue of shoppers lined up in front of the counter. When it was finally my turn though, the sales clerk instinctively plucked a game from an adjacent container and began ringing up a fresh new copy of NCAA Football 2002 for PlayStation 2. Turns out, everyone in the line was there for the latest in digital college football simulation, not Klonoa 2. I sheepishly interrupted the clerk and asked for Klonoa 2 instead. He looked confused, then turned around and rummaged through a small box. They had 5 copies. I managed to purchase one of those copies and then left for home to begin my journey into the world of Lunatea. I was not disappointed. Klonoa 2 begins with a splash, quite literally. Following the first appearance of the Klonoa Works logo, suggesting big plans for the series perhaps, the game's first stage takes place during a fierce thunderstorm. Waves crash against the rocks below as a barrage of PlayStation 2 fueled particles pour down upon the player. As you step forward and gaze into the background, the newfound sense of scale hits you. That large statue, bathed in light from the heavens, is your goal. That's the end of the level, and you can see it right from the game's starting position. This revelation instantly communicates to the player the advantages of the new PlayStation 2, suggesting a larger adventure in wait. Klonoa 2 features more stages, new play mechanics, and some unexpected surprises, and from the start, it channels the second design pillar we discussed earlier in the video, the graphics, which is where I'd like to begin. As a then next-generation game, Klonoa 2 is awash in technology upgrades, enabling level design possibilities that simply weren't feasible in the original. The increase in world complexity combines with more dramatic camera angles to create some rather memorable sequences. It's not perfect, of course. It runs using PlayStation 2's 640 by 448 interlaced mode, so it does suffer from the jaggies, as they say, but if you look beyond this, it's a beautiful game. And as you dive in, gaze into the background, and you'll notice distant areas are already teeming with life, awaiting the player's inevitable arrival. Curious to see how this frame is drawn? Well, it starts with this, a single background color, which serves as the basis for the skybox, which looks like this once drawn. Now, watch as the rest of the background materializes. What you're seeing here is a sequence created using RenderDoc in combination with the emulator PCSX2. I thought it was a neat visualization that provides some insight into a single frame, at least as rasterized by PCSX2. Note how in this other scene, the ocean is drawn in these long vertical strips. The water is an interesting thing that we'll discuss shortly. Over the course of the game then, you'll find yourself exploring these luscious backgrounds from top to bottom. And one of the ways you'll be doing that stems from the refreshed roster of foes, including the Jetimo, which propels Klonoa to lofty new heights, or these cannons, which can blast you across huge chasms, showcasing the background detail in the process. This newfound sense of scale made possible on PlayStation 2 really enhances the game. One of the more popular visual features prominent during this era are particles. Heck, the system even launched with Fantavision, a game based entirely around fireworks, so it should be of no surprise that Klonoa 2 leverages this as well. The rainy stage is an impressive start, but such particles appear throughout the adventure. Fireworks fill the skies of Joliand. Gently flowing particles of ash surround the ancient ark, while Mira Mira enjoys this beautiful fresh snow. The sense of motion and atmosphere made possible through the particle system really elevates the presentation, I feel. Klonoa 2 also introduces dynamic lighting. Each blast of your wind bullet triggers a brief flash of light. There's even an entire stage built around light. When you revisit the Sea of Tears, for instance, which is now bathed in darkness on the second run-through, Klonoa can capture a new entity known as a Flolo, illuminating the scene briefly in the process. It's a neat trick. And how about that water? We've got to talk about that, right? Throughout the game, you'll traverse water-filled stages with this beautiful effect, especially noticeable in the first level. But how is this achieved? Well, it turns out the water in Klonoa 2 actually relies on a video-based texture asset. VT-IPU movie files are applied and tiled across the moving water mesh, lending it an almost pixel shader-like appearance and motion. When enjoyed on a real PS2, the effect is extremely convincing, with its video-based nature only becoming evident when utilizing emulators at higher than expected resolutions. It works extremely well. The mix of expanded level geometry, particles, and lighting effects all work in tandem to lend this game an even richer appearance. And it's not just the backgrounds either. Klonoa 2 leaves the pre-rendered sprites behind in favor of fully modeled 3D everything. Klonoa and his friends are rendered using Namco's take on cel shading, a then still new technique pioneered in games such as Jet Set Radio on Sega Dreamcast. They called it the Klonoa filter. Story sequences now feature more personality as a result of the close-ups and increasingly dramatic camera angles. It's a great mechanism for telling the story, and what a story it is. For the sequel, the development team refreshed the design of the characters then. Klonoa is lankier in his real-time 3D form. I've often wondered if perhaps the decision to abandon his oversized collar from the original game was made to avoid potential clipping issues. Keep this in mind when we get to the remake, by the way. Playing Klonoa 2 through fresh eyes then, even in the face of said remake, I was surprised and delighted by how visually attractive and smooth it remains even now. It's an impressive visual feast, but there's more to this one than just the graphics.
Even with the additional graphical prowess of the PS2 behind it, the same adherence to complexity through simplicity is immediately felt in Klonoa 2. After all, there was very little reason to change what worked so well gameplay-wise from the original, and it's clear that Namco wanted to preserve this purity of design. But that doesn't mean that Klonoa hasn't evolved in key areas. The fundamentals remain predominantly the same. It's still a 2-button action game, and you'll run and jump and double jump your way through beautifully designed stages on your way to the end. Much of the expanded gameplay comes from a wider variety of enemies, many of which have unique moves or attacks tied to them when you catch them with your wind bullet. Electrical enemies will give Klonoa a supercharged burst dash, while circular helicopters can be spun up by jamming on the X button, allowing for controlled flight. Many of the one-off gameplay scenarios from Door to Phantom Isle make a return and are expanded upon. Levels that switch between 2 distinct modes mimic the light and dark chapter from the original. You'll also be manipulating ticking time bombs next to switches fairly often. In general, there's a tendency to lean heavier on puzzles overall, but it's integrated into the flow of the levels more efficiently. The increased level size allows the designers to play with new level concepts too. Specifically, the addition of the hoverboard used at several key points throughout the game. Klonoa 2 remains primarily a side-scrolling platformer, but these sections tend to integrate 3D platforming into the mix and give the player a taste of a wider range of movement. Yeah, it's still technically on rails, but you'll find yourself launching over obstacles or narrowly avoiding bottomless pits. It adds a lot of variety to the experience. Klonoa 2 also introduces players to a Super Mario-style world map after completing the opening stage. While it contains comparatively fewer stages compared to the Plumber's Adventures, each stage is sizable and unique. The game is broken up to 5 kingdoms, with each kingdom offering its own themed levels. While it's true that you'll revisit key stages along the way to the end, even these mix things up with new wrinkles the second time through, such as a fast-paced chase sequence through the war-torn Volk City. The addition of an action button mapped to L1 and L2 caused Klonoa to strike a cool pose, and is largely inconsequential. The developers claim that this was to make the player feel like they were inhabiting the role of Klonoa more, but that's kind of a stretch if you ask me. Most will just think it's fun to see him pull some rad moves while snowboarding.
Coury isn't wrong on that. I know I can't get enough of Klonoa's radical moves. Heck, several key boss fights are also built around the snowboarding mechanics, resulting in greater variety when it comes to stomping out the big bads. But it's not just those mechanics that make the boss fight so interesting. Sure, you still have your donut-style encounters like the original game, but other battles take full advantage of new traversal options. I especially love the integration of bounce pads into a key boss battle. Launching high into the air from a bounce pad as the camera tilts down just in time to deliver a direct hit feels amazing. Really, Klonoa 2 is just a masterclass in controlled spectacle. The game is responsive and tightly paced, yet there's this real sense of performative energy pulsing through its design. Everything just feels delightfully exaggerated in pursuit of fun. But of course, nothing enhances the platforming experience quite like a catchy soundtrack. As mentioned earlier in this video, Namco had established itself as a major player in the video game music scene, and by 2001, things were better than ever. Following the release of the original Klonoa game, Namco published stone-cold classics such as Ridge Racer Type 4 with its smooth soundtrack. Mr. Driller, and of course, Tekken Tag Tournament, among many others. For Klonoa 2, given the superlative quality of the original game's score, expectations were high. Veteran composers were joined by fresh recruits to create a brand new score for this adventure, and the result is expectedly superb. The soundtrack features a wide variety of music, ranging from dreamy, optimistic melodies such as this, to bouncy tracks like this, more atmospheric pieces, and it even goes into the realm of unsettling. We'll discuss this particular track later, as it's important to the game's story, but the point is now, Klonoa 2's soundtrack is as vast and memorable as one could hope. It lives up to that original game in every way. Even better, the developers implemented a music system that allows the game to fade between two different versions of the same track depending on whether you're indoors or outdoors. Take a listen. But there's an interesting technical wrinkle I wanted to mention here. Klonoa 2 supports Dolby Digital 5.1 playback in select sequences. Now remember, the PlayStation 2 does not support real-time interactive Dolby Digital decoding, as was possible on the Xbox, but using the optical output of the console, it can play back Dolby 5.1 soundtracks. This is something necessary for DVD movies, and it's basically how the team used it for Klonoa 2. They have a pre-recorded audio sequence that plays during the real-time graphics rendering for specific cutscenes. Then you have the voice acting. This time, voice quality is improved. While only stored at 22 kHz, the actual playback is a lot cleaner than the highly muffled original. There are also more spoken lines throughout the game, and perhaps most interestingly, the Mountains of Mira Mira stage features a vocal track performed using the fictional language. But of course, the voice acting plays an important role when it comes to establishing the narrative, which is something we should discuss right now.
After the emotional impact of the original game's ending, the development team was put in a difficult spot. You can't just take that same approach a second time and expect similar reactions. To that end, Klonoa 2 presents a different sort of tale, one in which Klonoa is now more aware of his unique place as the Dream Traveler. Overall, the story is quite a bit more mature than the original. What begins as a quest to obtain 4 elements while trading blows with the sky pirate Liarina and her companion Tat, the story takes a darker turn late in the game. This time around, cutscenes are rendered in-engine. While I lamented the loss of the full-motion video cutscenes featured in the original, it makes sense given the change from pre-rendered character sprites to the cel-shaded ones in Lunatea's Veil. CG animation would seem at odds with the look and style of the rest of the game, but at times it is sorely missed. By the time you reach the climax, it really becomes apparent that this is a more grown-up and experienced Klonoa. He knows what's going to happen, and has more or less accepted that he is doomed to a Sam Beckett-like experience, where he leaps from world to world, forges relationships, solves their problems, and then has to leave, never to see his friends again. Or at least that's what Namco would have you believe.
One key aspect of the narrative I'd like to touch on myself, though, involves the game's final stages and the deeper meaning hidden within. Be warned though, there are spoilers and speculation coming up. As Klonoa floats through the void during the game's introduction, he hears a call for help from a mysterious voice just before arriving in Lunatea. You're quickly distracted by your new friends and a quest for the 4 elements, but this mysterious voice is heard at various points throughout the story. This turns out to be the King of Sorrow, the ruler of the 5th kingdom Diodina sought to raise from its ashes in order to plunge the rest of the world into sorrow. But it's not that simple. Klonoa 2's storyline is surprisingly ambiguous. What is the purpose of Klonoa in this world? What do these characters represent? Who even is the King of Sorrow? Fans have discussed all of this over the years, but there's one key moment that really sticks out to me. It's the arrival in the Kingdom of Sorrow. As one of the game's final stages, the Kingdom of Sorrow represents a fierce challenge for players, not only gameplay-wise, but in its deeper meaning. Remember that track I played earlier? Listen closely. Does that sound familiar? Well, listen again. Yes, buried within the distorted notes, you'll hear remnants of music from the original Klonoa, Door to Phantom Mile. This is the track played during the final moments with Klonoa's grandfather in the original game, or at least that's what he believed when he experienced this traumatic moment. I mention this because during other cutscenes in the original game, Grandpa can be seen resting in his rocking chair. These sequences share the same theme, by the way, just faster. But gaze into the background in the Kingdom of Sorrow, and you might notice abandoned rocking chairs scattered all across the stage. Getting the picture now? There's a sense that this stage might actually represent something akin to repressed memories of an imaginary life in Phantom Isle. It's as if we're seeing the distorted echoes of Klonoa's memories visualized within this new game world. And the actual name of the Kingdom of Sorrow is Huponia, similar to the friend Hupo he left behind in that first game. There's also visual similarities between Huponia and Vision 6-2 from the original game as well. Only now it stands as a distorted skeleton of a past that only exists as a memory. And when you finally encounter the King of Sorrow himself, there's this sense that he's something else entirely. I don't want to go too far down this hole of speculation, but many of the design choices feel very deliberate. The symbolism on display left a strong impact on me as I completed the game, and that's not even getting into other characters such as Lolo. As you play through the game, try to keep this in mind and perhaps you'll feel it too. But okay, let's say you want to play this version of Klonoa 2 today. What are your options? Well, unfortunately, Klonoa 2 was less widely available than the original game, and if you wanted an official copy of it, your only option was to hunt down a disc. It was never sold as a PS2 classic for PlayStation 3 owners, and the unofficial repackagings of the game into the PS2 classics format exhibit glitches and crashing later in the game. There is one unofficial option, however, PCSX2. While older builds struggled to emulate this game properly, the most up-to-date builds of PCSX2 offer a generally good emulated experience. It's not glitch-free, but it's very playable and allows for higher resolution rendering, and it's a very decent way to enjoy it. Alas, aside from these solutions, Klonoa 2 has been relatively inaccessible for years, but thankfully that all changed with the arrival of the Fantasy Reverie series, which is something we'll discuss shortly. Revisiting Klonoa 2, however, has cemented my feeling that this is a very special game indeed. Fans of the series often point to the original as the superior game, but Klonoa 2 is every bit its equal in my book. The stage design is just exceptionally well done, with a perfectly balanced difficulty curve that ramps up smoothly right up until the end. The presentation, the new gameplay elements, and the storytelling, everything is top tier. Alas, Klonoa 2 is the final mainline entry in the series, and by the end of 2002, Klonoa would go dormant for years. Before we reach that point, however, Namco would release 4 additional Klonoa games, including a brand new game on the original PlayStation, which is perhaps not exactly what you might expect. Following the release of Klonoa 2, Namco's floppy-eared hero would make his return to the world of portable gaming. But before we talk about his adventures on Game Boy Advance, I want to talk about another game, Klonoa Beach Volleyball. Released in Japan on April 25, 2002, and later in Europe, Klonoa Beach Volleyball is an exceptionally late release for the Sony PlayStation, arriving more than 2 years after the PlayStation 2. The game kicks off with the Klonoa Works banner, and yeah, cross-checking the game's credits, you'll find a lot of familiar staff are involved in the creation of beach volleyball. In a sense, the simple arcade action in beach volleyball almost feels like a nod to Namco's past. Remember Super Family Tennis or the Smash Court series? It feels a lot like a natural extension of those games. And yeah, Klonoa Beach Volleyball is an arcade-style volleyball game, featuring the cast from the first 2 Klonoa games. Like Namco's tennis titles, Klonoa Beach Volleyball is rather light on features. You have a championship mode, which basically serves as its arcade mode, allowing you to select a team and then play through a series of matches until the end, as well as an exhibition mode, which gives you free reign over the game's available options. If you fancy a game of multiplayer, it even supports the PlayStation 1 multi-tap, enabling 4 players simultaneous play. Mechanically, it's very simple, but it feels remarkably satisfying to play. Your main actions are executed using X and square, but you also have a taunt button and, of course, a super move. One curious change with beach volleyball, the fictional language featured in prior games is completely replaced with proper recorded lines. In the Japanese version of the game, that means they speak Japanese, while the PAL version received an English localization. That's surprisingly not half bad. Visually, it's a rather attractive PlayStation game too. The game's tech director also served this role on Klonoa 2, so you know it's in good hands, and yeah, as a late generation Namco game, it holds up very well. This time, the characters are rendered in full 3D, with geometrically simple but stylishly designed models that are very expressive and well animated, though perhaps a little bit too Rayman at times, if you catch my drift. The shift to 3D, however, comes at a cost, as the frame rate is now reduced to just 30 frames per second, making this the only Klonoa game falling short of at least 60 frames per second. Ultimately, beach volleyball is kind of a puzzling game. On one hand, expanding into the world of volleyball is a fun idea and not necessarily unusual for mascot characters, plus Namco has years of experience in creating arcade games like this. Yet at the same time, the choice of platform is baffling. Why develop this for the original PlayStation? It feels like any chances of success were instantly limited by this decision. I'm sure Namco opted to skip the game for North American release for this very reason. Still, if you're a diehard Klonoa fan, it's certainly worth a look. But now, let's rewind back to the summer of 2001 as Klonoa returns to the world of handhelds. Beginning in July of 2001 and ending the following December, Klonoa would receive 3 new games for Nintendo's then new Game Boy Advance, its next generation portable. The first of these 3 arrived on July 19th in Japan and regrettably September 11th, 2001 in the US. Known in the West as Klonoa Empire of Dreams, this new game serves as both a follow-up and pseudo-remake of the WonderSwan game, only this time in full color, and with plenty of new features in tow. It was developed through a partnership with Now Production, or NowPro, a development company Namco had been working with for more than a decade at this point. They even helped create the earlier Wagyan Land games that I mentioned. The story presentation has been significantly improved over Moonlight Museum, with more artwork and a clever reliance on sprite scaling to communicate the story beats. Yoshizawa himself was even involved in the creation of this storyline, which focuses on an insomnia-stricken king who has forbidden his subjects from dreaming, declaring it illegal. Klonoa is arrested for this crime, but eventually given the chance to repent by defeating 4 beasts occupying nearby lands. In the end, it's not a bad little story, but the existence of Hupo within this world sort of negates the mainline console games, thus it's not really clear when, where, or how the story could even occur. But once you actually dive into the game, there's plenty of meat to sink your teeth into. Empire of Dreams features 5 worlds, each with 7 visions, and a boss battle, plus a new set of challenging EX levels. Unlike the WonderSwan game, however, these visions are presented via a beautiful world map system, complete with this nifty scaling feature, used as you select each level. The stages here feature more variety this time around. You'll spend most of your time collecting stars in order to unlock the stage exit, exactly like the WonderSwan game. And the challenge here stems from puzzling your way through each level in pursuit of these star fragments. This time, however, new stage types have been introduced to the mix. The first focuses on hoverboarding, similar to Klonoa 2, only viewed from the side. Klonoa 2 was in development during the same time, so it kinda makes sense, and in this game, the stages feature auto-scrolling, asking the player to dodge foes and pits while collecting dreamstones. They're a lot of fun and add some nice variety to the game that was sorely lacking in the WonderSwan outing. The second type then is also auto-scrolling, but it focuses more on precision platforming, and these are also a great time. Of course, one of the larger additions is the inclusion of proper boss battles, asking the player to take down foes between each world. These battles are rather nifty though, as they feature scaling and rotation features, allowing the camera to zoom in and out like an old Neo Geo game as bosses spin around the arena effortlessly. It's a great way to showcase what the GBA is capable of. And it's also interesting to see the ways in which Moonlight Museum factors into this new game. Empire of Dreams' first level, for instance, basically reuses the same design that was already featured in Moonlight Museum, with most of the differences stemming from tweaks to object placement and of course the new tile sets. There is a lot of brand new content in the GBA game, of course, but it's interesting to see how many of the stages from Moonlight Museum were repurposed for this game, which kinda makes sense given the more limited audience. Unfortunately, this also highlights one of my complaints with the GBA game: the background design. What do I mean? Well, check it out. So on GBA, the main background layer is basically just an image that remains fixed in place. It never scrolls with the rest of the screen. Instead, a second background layer, which is relatively simple by the way, does scroll and is placed directly in front of this first static layer. It appears somewhat disconnected as a result. Over on WonderSwan, however, note how the background functions in a way more typical of classic parallax scrolling. The main layer scrolls alongside the foreground but at a reduced speed to enhance the parallax effect. The clouds then scroll at their own speed, lending further to the depth of the environment. The point is, I don't really like the static backdrops in GBA and feel that it kinda cheapens the presentation despite the addition of color. This is furthered by the new world tiles, which feel exceptionally blocky, almost akin to a Lego set. Every stage is fully boxed in too, without the open sky areas that were used in certain stages on WonderSwan, and the different tiles really feel disconnected here. It's almost like in an effort to expand the tile set, the developers failed to create transitional tiles to connect the world together, so you have things like a wooden platform set floating directly next to a rock formation, or something else like that. Neither of these are really connected. But when you look at the WonderSwan game, even though it's lacking in variety, its world construction feels a lot more refined, as individual tiles more elegantly connect to one another. It becomes even more evident while exploring these interior sections. On WonderSwan, there are a layer of tiles behind Klonoa that act as the supporting structure for the level, and you can still see the parallax background behind this. On GBA, everything just sort of floats in midair with no rhyme or reason. Hopefully you get the rough idea of what I'm saying, but while I think it looks nice enough on GBA, it doesn't quite hit the mark for me visually. That being said, the actual sprite work is significantly better on Game Boy Advance, with many more frames of animation and scaling effects to simulate squash and stretch. Like here, if you hold an enemy and jump into the bottom of a platform, you'll see him squish, just like the console game. but on WonderSwan, that doesn't happen at all. So while I do have nitpicks with the visuals, it's still a nice looking game overall, I'd say. Audio-wise, it is however a step up from the WonderSwan game, which had very few tracks and what was there was extremely simplistic. Though in this case it uses a mix of samples with the Gameboy sound chip, producing a sort of hybrid sound that would become somewhat common on the platform. The good part here is that it doesn't have the ultra scratchy sound of many Game Boy Advance games. Now 1 year later, Namco and NowPro followed this up with Kaze no Klonoa G2, Dream Champ Tournament, at least in Japan that is. You see, despite its 2002 release date, the North American version didn't even arrive until 3 years later in 2005, and it never appeared in European countries either. Furthermore, Yoshizawa was not involved in the production of this follow-up, further distancing itself from the main series. Despite this, Klonoa G2 is very much a direct continuation of the prior portable entries. It uses the same core technology and exhibits all of the same visual design choices, including the rather lackluster parallax scrolling. There are some changes, yes, but if you've played Empire of Dreams, you know exactly what to expect here. So what is new, you ask? Well, G2 features the inclusion of these new underwater sections, which have Klonoa navigating the world in a submarine. While it can be a little frustrating at times, it does add some much needed variety to the mix. Secondly, and more successfully I'd say, they've introduced a new pseudo 3D hoverboard stage that has Klonoa gliding into the screen while dodging obstacles along the way. It uses GBA's sprite scaling capabilities as well, and it looks awesome in motion. This is still very much a continuation of the last two portable games, however, and all three form a trilogy of sorts. This style of slower paced, puzzle driven Klonoa gameplay is a lot of fun though, and some people even prefer these over the console games, but for my money, the two mainline entries are still a lot more enjoyable. But if you're hankering for more Klonoa and you've not played them, it's definitely worth a shot, and you can still get them on the Wii U's Virtual Console. Then, in December 2002, Namco unleashed one final entry on Nintendo's Game Boy Advance with Klonoa Heroes Densetsu no Star Medal, Klonoa's first role-playing game. Yep, Heroes is, at its core, a multi-character action RPG. The story is told through these small animated portraits that bounce and scale around the screen, effectively communicating the intended mood. You'll travel from vision to vision, much like the more traditional Klonoa titles, but this time, the action takes place from above. Using this overhead perspective, Klonoa and friends will explore these mini dungeons, amassing treasure, useful items, and taking out foes along the way. Visually, Heroes is a curious one. The sprites are big, bold, and super well animated, and the backgrounds are very detailed, with buttery smooth scrolling and some nice effects like this reflective water. But at the same time, the backgrounds are also somewhat repetitive, and a large chunk of the screen real estate is sacrificed in favor of this giant information panel. The gameplay window shares more in common with an original Game Boy game than a GBA one. At least you can customize the info panel to your liking with different available color schemes. Now, over the course of the game, you'll spend most of your time switching between the three main characters while unleashing their different attacks. There are gameplay sections which involve using vehicles, however, such as a submarine, which does add some variety, but by and large, the game is a little on the repetitive side. Each vision is broken up into different chunks, and between these different areas, you'll have access to a menu allowing you to save your game, use items, or change equipment. The level design is not randomized, thankfully, but it definitely feels like a dungeon crawler when you get right down to it. Audio-wise, Heroes mostly follows in the footsteps of the prior GBA Klonoa titles through a combination of samples and chiptunes. A fully sample-based soundtrack would have likely required additional cartridge space, which was perhaps not included in the game's budget. They did, however, produce a vocal theme specifically for Klonoa Heroes, but unlike Stepping Wind in Klonoa 2, this one is done in Japanese. It is, however, sung by the same voice actress, Kumiko Watanabe, who voices Klonoa throughout the series. For a GBA game, it's not half bad. Ultimately, Klonoa Heroes is a breezy little action RPG. It gets repetitive, but it works better than you might expect, though at the same time it does feel strange that the final original Klonoa game is Klonoa Heroes, given how far it strays from the mainline series. I wonder what Namco intended with this game. If you've always wanted to play Klonoa Heroes then, but aren't proficient in Japanese, there's good news. A fan translation exists, allowing you to enjoy the game in English if you so desire. And for many Klonoa fans, this might just be the missing shard from your memories of the series as a whole, so give it a shot. After the release of Klonoa Heroes, however, Namco closed the book on our little hero for the time being, at least when it comes to starring in his own games.
Despite all of his ups and downs over the years, Klonoa has remained one of Namco's favorite characters in-house. He's been referenced or has cameoed in a ton of different games since his introduction in 1997. Let's see how many we can find. Not long after the first Klonoa's release, Namco decided to use some of the clout that Ridge Racer had with PlayStation fans by putting a track called Phantomile in Ridge Racer Type 4 on the PS1. Although Klonoa doesn't appear in the game himself. I guess he just wasn't old enough to drive yet. The track is adorned with billboards for the game, appearing next to giant balloons of Namco's most well-known characters, Pac-Man and Dig Dug. By the year 2000, Namco ramped up the Big K's appearances significantly in preparation for the fast-approaching Klonoa 2. Though he still has some unfinished business on the original PlayStation. Klonoa's head is one of many different Namco characters portrayed during the Shoot the Sample game in Point Blank 3. He was also an unlockable character in the PS1 tennis game Smash Court 3, if you were able to get an A rank in Expert mode. In the arcade, the little guy was a member of the Namco 90s All-Star team in the Sega Naomi hardware-based soccer game World Kicks. On the PlayStation 2, you could take control of Klonoa, complete with his Lunatea's Veil hoverboard in the Japan and Europe exclusive Alpine Racer 3. Not only is he the best character in the game, but the announcer has a variety of introductions for him.
Give it up for the floppiest ears in town. Here's Klonoa, the Master Dream Traveler.
MotoGP on the PS2 gave Klonoa his highest profile side gig yet, appearing as an oversized and, let's face it, hilarious playable character. Mounted up on his baby blue beach cruiser style bike, seeing Klonoa on the racetrack ranks as almost as funny as a PC filled with beans. Series-related characters, locations, and themes are unlockable in Namco's Family Tennis on the Game Boy Advance, Family Stadium 2003 on the GameCube, and even Pro Baseball Femista 2011 on the 3DS. Then there's Namco Cross Capcom, a cool Japanese exclusive strategy game for the PS2 that throws a ton of characters from both companies into a ridiculous story. Klonoa and Gantz from Klonoa Heroes appear pretty early on in this story. Klonoa speaks in full Japanese this time around, which is an understandable, if disappointing, change.
おっしゃ、クロノア。黄金の騎士が出てくるまで、ちょいと遊ぶとしようぜ。
わっへー！ウォーミングアップってやつだね。
This was one of those games that I just couldn't believe didn't get localized back in 2005, but at least a fan translation makes it playable for English speakers today. The follow-ups, Project X Zone and Project X Zone 2 on the 3DS, were localized for English-speaking audiences, but unfortunately, Klonoa doesn't appear in either of these games for whatever reason. For about the last decade, Klonoa's main appearances have been little references and inconsequential DLC items, like this hat, a statue, I don't know, whatever it is, DLC in Soul Calibur 5. I bought the DLC pack with this thing in it for 99 cents, just so I could show you my hastily created custom character wearing it in this video. Outside of minor appearances like those, Namco made the disappointing call to put full-fledged Klonoa games on an extended hiatus for the foreseeable future. That is, until a certain Nintendo console seemed like the perfect place to stage a revival and bring the character back to the forefront.
Launched in late 2006, Nintendo surprised everyone with the success of its new Wii console. With the Wii, Nintendo dropped out of the tech race, aiming instead to deliver new ways to play, as opposed to focusing on high-definition graphics, and it paid off big time. But it wasn't just about motion control. You see, Nintendo also helped kickstart a newfound appreciation for classic gaming, thanks in part to the launch of Virtual Console, a service which made classic Nintendo games available to Wii owners for a low price. It was a huge success, and I'd argue this resurgence of classic 2D gamings made remakes and re-releases more viable as well, and as a result, the 2D platformer kinda sorta returned to prominence, at least for a while. We received 2 brand new Mega Man games created in the style of the NES originals, a gorgeous remake of Bionic Commando from Capcom. Nintendo created a brand new 2D Mario game, while both Kirby and Donkey Kong returned to the respective worlds in full 2.5D glory. And then there was Klonoa. Released in 2008, Klonoa is a complete remake of Door to Phantomile from the PlayStation, developed exclusively for Nintendo Wii. Japanese web surfers circa 2008 were treated to a mini-game in the lead-up to release on the official Klonoa homepage called Moo Attack. In this puzzle game, players are tasked with hoarding Klonoa's Dreamstones by preventing Moos from snatching them. You run back and forth, using your wind bullet to snap up Moos and fling them back into the crowd strategically. It's not a bad little game, and I suppose that it could be argued that this, rather than Klonoa Heroes, is the last actual original Klonoa game. Namco didn't forget about its American customers though. Early copies of Klonoa include a voucher for a free taco from Wahoo Tacos. Created primarily by a new team with involvement from Yoshizawa and other veterans, Klonoa for Wii was designed to reintroduce the series to new players. It uses an entirely new graphics engine, taking advantage of the Wii's hardware. It supports 480p and widescreen, features full 3D character models as opposed to sprites, and includes newly recorded voice acting. And that includes both the fictional Phantomelian language and 2 human languages in the form of Japanese or English, depending on the region. I'm thankful that the Phantomelian language option was retained though, as the English dub is interesting to say the least. Take a listen.
I wonder if Ghadius and Joker are involved. Well, we can't go any further try going to Jugpot?
Sure, let's go.
My mom is in the castle, and there's something wrong with her. Could you please save her? She's probably been brainwashed or something.
Okay, we'll see what we can do.
Okay, so it's not actually that bad, but it is a little weird hearing these same voices used for the voice clips played during gameplay.
Wahoo!
When using the Phantom IO option, however, the voices have been re-recorded for the Wii version and the script somewhat rewritten. The actual bitrate of the voice files is also much higher than the original game.
Very good.
I do.
Puppy. Your puppy.
The core gameplay and story beats have all been successfully retained for this version. It plays just as well as the original and feels great. In bringing it to the Wii, however, the development team instituted a number of key changes. Firstly, Klonoa's character was redesigned once more. He's now lankier, more in line with Klonoa 2, and he lacks the oversized collar of that original design. At one point, a North American specific redesign was even considered, but thankfully, cooler heads prevailed. The Wii version does include a costume selection option. If you prefer his outfit from Klonoa 2, for example, you can use it. And that's just scratching the surface of the options available in this version. There's a reverse mode that lets you play mirrored versions of every stage in the game, and a bunch of other bonus features as well, so it is fully packed. While the level design has received some tweaks and changes, this is fundamentally Door to Phantom Isle rebuilt for the Wii. But until now, I've never really sat down to examine the two side by side, so let's dive into some direct comparisons, shall we? So the first major difference you might notice is the introduction sequence. The original PlayStation game features 3 gorgeous pre-rendered CGI sequences strategically placed throughout the game. For the remake, the developers instead opted to render each of these scenes in real time, like Klonoa 2. This means recreating those original scenes using the game engine, and while I do think something is lost in the translation, it feels better integrated into the gameplay. And once you're handed control, the difference in fidelity becomes immediately obvious, but I dare say in this instance, the game is equally beautiful on both platforms. The Wii release is simply a new take on those original concepts. It's no small task either. The PlayStation game relies heavily on simplified shapes to create the illusion of a detailed world while keeping that polygon budget in check. This opens the door to more artistic interpretation in rebuilding the game. There isn't anything that can be reused on the Wii, so the designers had to create something entirely new, using the PS1 game as an inspiration. Structures are now much more detailed. The distant background uses a shallow depth of field effect, lending it an almost tilt-shift-like aesthetic. Backgrounds also extend further into the distance, increasing the sense of scale in the process. Here's a fun fact: the reflections visible across bodies of water in this game are rendered using the old-school method involving the placement of flipped geometry beneath the water plane. From above, it looks like distorted reflections, but in reality, it's just additional polygons. Another neat feature? We're standing on this multi-tiered wooden platform, but if you look closely, there's visible shadows present on the Wii. But these shadows are not projected in real time and are instead baked into the art, yet it's surprisingly effective in motion, I think. Arriving in the second stage, that original game relies heavily on a mix of vertex-painted lighting and textures designed to simulate sparkling crystals. This is somewhat retained on the Wii, and the overall color scheme is very similar. The TEV is used again to create the specular reflection effect across the background, which looks pretty good, I think. You should have also noticed that all objects in the game are now fully 3D on Wii. Enemies, main characters, collectibles, all modeled out, again, like Klonoa 2. Even with the additional geometry, the Wii version does not need to rely on distance fog to limit the amount of detail drawn in a scene, lending the stage a slightly enhanced sense of scale. Further in, we're back outside, and you might notice a scrolling cloud texture layer is applied to the environment, designed to create the illusion of clouds filling the skies above. The brief rain shower on PlayStation does not seem to trigger in the remake, however. Then we arrive at the first boss battle. Cutscenes all feature completely reworked camera angles, and the boss arena itself has lost its grassy covering in favor of modeled stonework. The bell is now more rounded, and features a reflection map applied to its surface, but it mostly plays the same. I love this cave entry. The artistry so confidently displayed here, both in terms of camera work and lighting, cannot be understated, but for a fun bonus, check out those waterfalls behind Klonoa here. You can see the previous area through the water, suggesting that you're platforming alongside the opposite side of the wall that you have previously traversed. So how does this actually work? Well, if we zoom in, just as the camera passes the point of the waterfall, you'll see that the artists have carefully modeled and placed lower resolution structures representing the outdoor areas against a textured background. From within the stage itself, it's a convincing effect, don't you think? And there's similar design decisions made in the next stage as well. On PlayStation, only the foreground is drawn using 3D graphics, but the Wii version seems to stretch out further into the distance. Thanks to the depth of field, it feels rich in detail, but if we actually stop and look closely, you'll see that the developers have placed a layer of modeled tree trunks first, followed by simple flat textures of tree trunks situated against a flat bitmapped layer. Now, not every effect has been pulled off quite so successfully. In one of the game's later stages, you might recall my remark on the beautiful particles generated by Klonoa as he dashes across the surface. Over on the Wii, however, no equivalent effect has been implemented. Too bad. Overall, while the Wii version is perhaps not quite as special as that 1997 original, it's still a fantastic and robust remake in its own right. It looks beautiful, sounds great, and plays like a dream with support for a wide range of controllers. Plus, it features a lot of extra bonus material. If they had managed to include the PS1 original in there as a bonus, however unlikely, it would have been a near perfect release. Unfortunately, this remake of Klonoa for Nintendo Wii nearly killed the series entirely. It simply failed to find an audience this time, selling precious few copies in the process. For all intents and purposes, this was the end. At least that's how it felt. That is until 2019, when Namco filed a trademark for Kaze no Klonoa Encore. This was followed by further trademark filings a couple years later, sparking some hope for fans of the series. And then, at last, in February 2022, during a Nintendo Direct, Klonoa made his triumphant return. This is Klonoa Fantasy Reverie Series, also known as Kaze no Klonoa Encore in Japan, a complete remake of Klonoa 1 and 2 for modern platforms. Developed by Monkeycraft, the same team behind two other recent remakes, Katamari Damacy Reroll and Wonder Boy, Asha in Monster World, Fantasy Reverie series has been completely rebuilt using the Unity engine with new assets, visual changes, and other tweaks on the way. This is now the most affordable way to enjoy Klonoa, and at a glance the results are very good, but of course I wanted to dig a little deeper. Before we get into the comparisons with older versions, however, let's start with a little Digital Foundry basics, shall we? When it comes to playing Fantasy Reverie, for the first time in Klonoa history, you actually have a choice from multiple platforms. Here's what I can tell you. If you're playing on PS5 or Xbox Series X, you're going to get native 4K and it's going to run great. It also runs very well on Series S and the PC. But if you're limited to prior generation consoles, things get a little more tricky with less stable performance than the older systems. It runs well on every single last generation PlayStation and Xbox console, mostly delivering 60 frames per second. We're looking at the base PlayStation 4 version here, and yeah, it drops frames here and there, but by and large, it's very, very stable, which is exactly what you want from Klonoa. But there is one minor issue. The loading times between doorways are longer than any other version of Klonoa, and this applies to all the hard drive based last generation consoles. But the real tragedy here is the Switch version, which struggles to run well, mostly hanging below the target 60 frames per second update. It's one black mark on an otherwise compelling package. A real shame though, as the Switch version could have been the premier release and really brought fans into the fold, but unfortunately it's just not good enough. That said, if you have access to one of the other platforms, you should definitely play this. I mean, if you've made it this far into the video and haven't played these games, this is easily the most accessible way to experience them today. Next, let's talk about the changes which apply to both games. So when you start a new game, you're given the option to select an easier difficulty if you prefer. You can take more hits and your win bullet travels further. I recommend the normal mode, but it's nice to have the option. Once you begin playing, you may notice something. The game now pauses every few steps to explain how to play. It's a 2-button action game. It doesn't require this level of explanation. The game attempts to walk first-time players through every possible encounter in a way that feels entirely misguided. If you do need guidance, the Wii version already solved this by placing optional signposts along the path. If you needed help, you had the option to read the signs, but it never seized control away from you like these bothersome tutorial windows. By the time you reach the first doorway, the game will have interrupted you 7 different times with multiple screens of tutorials. Thankfully, if you pop into the options menu, this feature can be disabled, and I recommend doing that right away. While we're in here though, you may also notice the optional pixel filter as it's called, and it's interesting as it does accurately replicate the look of a 320 by 240 pixel game, and even reduces the color depth resulting in visible banding. But it's not like it makes the game look like a PlayStation 1 game either, so it's kind of a strange feature. Fantasy Reverie also retains the original fictional language spoken in both games, with no option for the English or Japanese dubs created for the Wii version. In fact, with Klonoa 1, they reverted back to the PlayStation version's lower quality audio, which does make sense when you realize that the modified script in the Wii version has been removed as well, so I'm okay with this decision. My biggest gripe with the new version, however, are these loading screens. Once again, the developers felt the need to cram tips and animated loading icons in places where I feel they just don't belong. In the PS1 original, between stages, the game saves to your memory card and then immediately you're loaded into the next stage without any loading screens. You walk through a door, it fades to black with a fancy animation, and then bam, you're there. It's seamless. In the new game, that's no longer the case. On last-gen consoles, I can understand the need for an icon as the loading times are regrettably longer, but on PS5 or the Xbox Series consoles, I feel this feature should have been eliminated in favor of a brief black screen. It just feels kinda sloppy when the loading icon appears for such a short period of time. The way the story is told also feels less elegant. The development team felt that users should be aware that it is in fact possible to both fast forward through every cutscene or skip them entirely if they so desire, and then display the associated text and button prompts on every single dialogue box throughout the game. Somehow having these buttons visible all the time robs the game of some of its narrative charm, almost as if the developers have decided that these scenes really aren't important enough, so why not just use the fast forward feature. The more elegant solution here would involve displaying these prompts only if the player tapped a button, then fade them out again if the appropriate button is not pressed within a few seconds. Now, this collection includes both Klonoa 1 and 2, but the way in which they've been brought to life differs. Klonoa 1 is based on the Wii version with some enhanced textures and replaced character models, but for Klonoa 2, the team remade all of the assets from scratch, making it a true remake. So let's begin with the first game. There's no real reason to linger on comparisons with the PlayStation original. The differences are much in line with the Wii version, so you kind of already know what to expect there. The main thing I can say here is that the new version brings the color back, so it does look rather vibrant, even more so than the PS1 original in some ways. Where it gets interesting though is when we bring that Wii version into the mix. The first thing you'll notice is the change in character models. The Wii redesigns have been replaced with new models more in line with the original 1997 game. Klonoa is now shorter, wearing his giant red collar, while his jaundice-ravaged yellow eyes make a full return. Hupo's hands in Halo have also mercifully been returned. I like these changes, but I have one small nitpick. The animation seems to have been derived directly from the Wii version, and as a result it doesn't fully match the new skeleton used for Klonoa. Wii Klonoa wasn't wearing the giant collar, so in this new version, this same oversized collar often clips through his arms and face. It's a little awkward, but thankfully only something you'll notice during these scenes. Now once we're in the game, you'll notice the new version features a much brighter, bolder appearance. The Wii version appears somewhat muted in comparison, while Fantasy Reverie goes hard on those primary colors we all love so much. The vibrant blue skies are especially attractive. They almost feel Sega-like. The only caveat here is that Fantasy Reverie now uses a bloom filter that can only be disabled in the PC version. When translating this game to new consoles, however, the developers have access to vastly more memory than on Wii. So what did they do with all this newfound memory? They created an entirely new set of high-resolution textures, that's what. The environments largely rely on Wii geometry data, but these new textures really freshen things up for that beautiful high-resolution output. Everything is sharper, more detailed and defined. It looks great overall, but not every scene feels like an improvement. In fact, the new version is lacking a number of key visual features. The depth of field is toned way down, or in the case of the Switch version, completely disabled. The cloud shadows are much less visible, though still present, and the water, to my eyes at least, is less visually striking, especially evident in areas featuring waterfalls. The lack of depth of field in particular becomes an issue in certain stages like this, where the lack of background detail becomes a lot more visible as a result of the increased clarity. On a more positive note, the new version of Klonoa features real-time dynamic shadows on moving entities, which looks pretty great in motion, I have to say. Overall though, I would argue that this version is an improvement over the Wii game. It's not perfect, but the strong colors, improved clarity, and the return of classic Klonoa are all welcome. I'm generally very happy with this one. Klonoa 2, on the other hand, is more of a mixed bag, and as we'll see in this next section, some areas look noticeably better, while others fall woefully short. Before we even start the game, I already have a nitpick, however. If you remember, on PlayStation 2, Klonoa 2 supported Dolby Digital 5.1 surround sound playback in certain scenes. Now you'd think that modern platforms, which are natively capable of real-time surround sound decoding, would feature this as well, but no, the Dolby Digital soundtrack is not present in this version, and in fact, the games are limited to just stereo output. So not only is the audio not enhanced, it's also worse than the original version. But alright, what about the visuals? The opening scene immediately highlights one of the biggest changes. The Klonoa filter, or cell shading, has been removed. I'm okay with this given the rest of the changes, but it took a little while to get used to. What I'm not okay with is the new version of Sea of Tears, the first stage. There's two big issues here. Firstly, the water. The beautiful ocean featured on PlayStation 2 gives way to this flat, less animated facade. I'm not a fan of this change at all. I feel like that original water effect could have been recreated in a shader, but they went for an entirely different style instead, and I don't really like it. Worse still, the PlayStation 2 particle shower has been replaced with a far less effective solution. The density of rain particles is reduced to a mere trickle, losing much of the ambience of this stage in the process. It's supposed to be stormy seas, but it no longer feels that way. Plus, the sky's color tone has changed a little too dramatically for my liking. The eerie, stormy yellow is completely erased. The characters, on the other hand, are generally much more geometrically dense, having been fully remodeled, and they do look pretty good. The environment itself is handsomely remodeled as well. Changes to lighting, effects, and water do detract from the overall look, but it's still suitably Klonoa 2, I'd say. Moving ahead, here's our first look at an interior section. The color scheme differs significantly and the reliance on bloom is a little on the heavy side, but I appreciate the more nuanced geometry and higher resolution textures. Plus, they've included a water caustics texture along the ceiling, which looks great. Alas, once back out in the rain, I just can't help but feel the remake falls short in this stage. This scene is so perfectly designed on PlayStation 2, the light piercing through the clouds just above the statue, the torrential rain and powerful waves smashing against the rocks. It's just missing something in this new version. It doesn't feel right. Needless to say, based on this first stage, I was concerned that Monkeycraft had botched Klonoa 2, but thankfully this feeling does not last, and many of the other stages going forward look comparatively fantastic. So let's jump to La La Kusha then, the next platforming stage. This is one of my favorites in the game, and I was thrilled with this new iteration. While the color tone differs, it's still very much in the same ballpark. It looks and feels right. The inclusion of real-time shadows lends extra depth to the environments, while the bloom filter manages to look great in this instance as well. Texture quality is hugely boosted across the board, but some scenes do look a little off, like this big jump here. The PS2 version uses faked shadows baked into the scene at the distance to create a proper sense of scale. The remake lacks this completely. It does, however, feature expanded geometry in the same area, but it doesn't quite feel the same. In another scene, the designers modified these wind vents designed to launch Klonoa into the air. In their original form, leaf particles are used to convey the movement of air, while the remake leans on streams of wind instead. So while this stage doesn't nail every aspect, I do think it's a successful translation of the original mood intended by the developers. The next scene then gives us a closer look at the characters. How do you feel about the removal of the Klonoa filter when seeing them up close? I could take it or leave it, I suppose. And how about this boss fight? Fulguran, the armor beast, casts shadows in this remake thanks to the new lighting model, and the sequence plays and looks great. A suitable upgrade, I'd say. But okay, let's get serious here and check out the jungle slider. This is one of those stages I kinda go back and forth on. There are aspects I prefer in the PS2 original. The contrast between the wooden structure and the deep blue water is certainly eye-catching, but the gentle rippling in the remake is certainly no slouch either. Real-time shadows once again pull their weight, while increased levels of geometry flesh out what we could once only imagine. I do have one nitpick, however. Later in this stage, while surfing below the jungle canopy, the designers attempt to simulate light filtering across the characters from the trees above. Look closely at Klonoa and the enemies in the scene and you kinda see what I mean. If we compare it with the remake, however, everything appears overly bright, completely missing this effect in the process. It kinda looks flat in comparison. The final section then features vastly more geometry in the distance versus PlayStation 2, which relies on a textured dome. At the same time, this is an instance where I kinda prefer the color tone of the original. It doesn't quite tantalize the senses to the same degree in this remake. This should give you a rough idea of how the remake stacks up. Changes of this magnitude persist throughout the game. Increased model detail, higher resolution textures, and real-time shadows contrast against stylistic changes, which can feel a little hit or miss at times. Overall though, the team has done a great job at translating Klonoa 2 to modern platforms, though I feel Klonoa 1 is a little closer to that original vision. Also worth a mention, while the voice acting and dialogue is mostly identical, the script has actually been touched up, so it doesn't read identically to that original PS2 localization. I do feel like perhaps I've been a little overly critical of this package, but this is born more out of love than anything else. And in reality, it's a very well executed collection. There are definitely areas which could be improved. The Switch version is nowhere near what it should be, and all the loading screens and tips kinda get on my nerves, but it's definitely a game you need to check out. And the Fantasy Reverie series is a great way to do so. So where does Klonoa even go from this point? It's difficult to say. If Fantasy Reverie series finds enough of an audience, perhaps we'll finally receive a third console installment, though at the same time, who would even make such a game, and would it live up to the classics? It's difficult to say. What I can say, however, is that having replayed every game in the series over these past few weeks, my admiration for the series, which was already high by the way, has only increased. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned the 4 pillars of great platforming, and I hope by this point you've developed a better appreciation of why I feel Klonoa satisfies each of these points. But it's not just the gameplay. There's an emotional component. The designers at Namco have managed to produce something that can fill you with joy one moment, while pulling your heartstrings the next. To leave such an impact on players, even decades after its release, is the true mark of a classic. One thing is for certain, however, Klonoa is a dream I'll never truly forget.